Welcome to Macro Musings, where each week we pull back the curtain and take a closer look at the most important macroeconomic issues of the past, present, and future. I am your host, David Beckworth, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and I'm glad you decided to join us. Our guest today is Bryan Cutsinger. Bryan is a monetary historian and economist from Florida Atlantic University. He's also a returning guest to the show. Bryan joins us today to discuss his latest work on growth-driven deflation in the late 19th century and its implications for policymakers today as we head into a potentially growth-driven environment created by AI. Bryan, welcome back to the program.
David, so good to be with you.
So it's a real treat to get you back on the program. I really encourage listeners to go back and check out the previous two programs with Bryan. The first one, he joined me and talked about a paper where he looked at the public financing of the U.S. Civil War, specifically the Confederacy. And ironically, they actually did not maximize the seigniorage flows they could have from their money printing, money financing of the war effort. So it's an interesting question. Historians have looked at why didn't they try to maximize it? And what Bryan argued and showed is that there were different parts of the Confederacy that had different goals and interests. And so they didn't get all the financing that they could have. And maybe we can thank them for that. The second time he came in more recently, he talked about the French Revolution and the hyperinflation. This was the first major hyperinflation in kind of Western society. It was Bryan and his co-author, Louis Wannat. Super fascinating conversation on an important period that really has shaped a lot of thought and questions. A lot of thinkers have looked back to this period. In fact, Bryan, I was reading and preparing for the show that even people in the Confederacy look back at the French Revolution and the hyperinflation surrounding it, and they tried to draw lessons from that. Apparently, they did not learn their lessons because they didn't maximize all the revenue, as we talked about earlier. And I just want to tie this into one other previous guest I had on. This was George Hall. And listeners will know he's been on several times, but he has a series of super fascinating papers with Tom Sargent. And they look at how does one finance big expenditures, wartime expenditures. And he compares France, the period that you cover, kind of leading up to the French Revolution, with the UK. And he shows how in the UK, they would run these big wartime expenditures, but then they would run primary surpluses. They would pay it off, kind of a Barrow model public finance. So the French wouldn't do that. And what's fascinating is what they point out in this paper is that we in the U.S. are a lot more like the French now than the British Empire. We run the big expenditures during World War I, World War II, but more recently, like COVID, if you consider that a war, a public health war, we have not been running primary surpluses. So we're not France, to be very clear. We're not headed to hyperinflation, but we're doing all the things that France did leading up to it. So that should be a warning sign. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, that time period in particular is very interesting because England is able to tax smooth, right? Which is sort of the basic idea here that if you have large increase in demand for public spending, you don't necessarily want to rely all on certainly printing money because the deadweight losses from massive amounts of inflation are quite large. And then, of course, raising taxes substantially in the middle of a war can reduce your economy's productive capacity. So the basic idea here is, can you borrow to essentially tax smooth rather than having to have very high tax rates? So I think absolutely, if you look at that period, right, England obviously is committed to then running primary surpluses after the war is over, and as a result is able to fund the war more effectively, whereas France did not have that option for a variety of reasons. One of them being, of course, that they are running quite a bit of inflation, which doesn't necessarily make your bondholders particularly keen on loaning you money insofar as those bonds are denominated in the currency that's being hyperinflated.
Yeah, super interesting history. You tell us in the previous time you're on how this starts off and how what was going to be a currency that was backed by land turns into fiat, which leads to inflation, hyperinflation. And if you take the story to its end, you get Napoleon and the emergence of the Central Bank of France. So it's a really interesting story. And again, I encourage listeners to go back and check it out. But the reason you're here, Bryan, is not to retell all that, but to look at a new paper you have written, a super fascinating paper as well. And this one is titled Rethinking Deflation and Its Effects, a cross-country analysis of supply-driven deflation. So why don't you maybe give us the executive summary of what you're trying to do in this paper?
Sure. So the basic idea here is that when you think about the question of how should central banks respond to supply shocks, the conventional wisdom, I think, is that at least in the case of a negative supply shock, we want central banks to look through them. So let the price level rise temporarily in response to a supply shock, and then it will come back down. But it's weird in that there's an asymmetry here, which is that I don't know a whole lot of people that, aside from say yourself and George Selgin and Scott Sumner and other market monitors, who say, yes, but do that symmetrically. So if you have a positive supply shock, the central bank should look through the negative effect on the price level, that is deflation. So what we want to do is we want to say, look, there's been a number of papers that have shown, both with some correlations and with some more sophisticated econometrics, that the link between deflation and poor economic performance historically is not very strong, leaving aside, of course, the Great Depression, which is very important episode. So we don't look so much at the effect on output. Instead, what we pick up as two themes that, if you look at the literature on why deflation is bad, you will see. One is there's this concern about falling nominal interest rates. So if nominal interest rates hit their effective lower bound, then it might be the case that monetary policy ends up being ineffective, right? So we get the standard liquidity trap type of argument. And the other problem that you see in the literature with deflation is you get financial disintermediation. You have falling asset or falling collateral values. People start defaulting on their loan. Bank capital starts falling. Then the banks start failing. Then other banks start calling in their loans. And this leads to this sort of spiral. So what we wanted to look at is those two issues in particular. We wanted to say, okay, is there any evidence historically that when we had supply-driven deflation, that we saw short-term nominal interest rates fall to their effective lower bounds or fall at all? And did we see a change or decrease, more specifically, in financial intermediation? And so that's what we look at specifically in the paper is, and we can get into this about how we try to identify supply versus demand-driven deflation. But the question we're really asking is, does supply-driven deflation appear to cause nominal interest rates to fall or financial intermediation to fall? Because these are two of the negative consequences that are often associated with a conventional view of deflation.
Yeah, if you were to ask probably most macroeconomists, even any economist, what do they think of in deflation? What's the first thing they think of when you have deflation? They probably will invoke the 1930s. They probably will invoke periods of unemployment, of falling bank intermediation, financial system weakening. And the point you're making is not so fast, right? There could be another form of that. And you actually mentioned in your paper, and I'm glad you did this, a speech by Ben Bernanke, and he was at the Board of Governors at the time. And the speech was a 2002 speech titled Deflation, Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here. And I think it's great for two reasons, because I think it speaks both to how to interpret the tea leaves of deflation, but secondly, a point that he makes. So for those who don't remember, 2002, 2004, we had a productivity surge. It took off, and that created these disinflationary pressures. And if you go back and read the Fed minutes, Fed statements from that period, transcripts, you'll see they were really worried about deflation emerging. Now, understandably, the context they were thinking about was Japan, late 1990s. They had the bad type of deflation, weak demand. But I would argue we were actually seeing disinflationary pressures, and ultimately deflation, should it emerge, coming from productivity gains during this period. And I think they were misreading the symptoms, but nonetheless, it's an important period. And so Bernanke is like, hey, how do we guarantee that we don't have, and in his mind, the bad type of deflation, the demand-driven deflation? And his whole speech is about this, right? And he completely overlooks this other possibility, except footnote 1, which you cite in your paper. So let me just read footnote 1 and get your response to this. So this is what he says in footnote 1, 2002 speech titled Deflation, Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here. Here's what he says. Conceivably, deflation could also be caused by a sudden, large expansion in aggregate supply arising, for example, from rapid gains in productivity and broadly declining cost. I don't know of any unambiguous example of a supply-side deflation, although China in recent years is a possible case. Note that a supply-side deflation would be associated with an economic boom rather than a recession. What are your thoughts about that comment?
Well, I think that exactly gets to the point that we're trying to make in the paper. And specifically, if you think about interest rates and financial intermediation. So let's start with interest rates. We've made these jokes, I think, on my past appearances before that I used to have this sign on my door that says, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach the man a Fisher effect, and he'll never confuse low interest rates with easy money or something along those lines. And so the point is, when you think about something like supply driven deflation, the key keeping in mind is that the neutral rate we tend to think of it as being somewhat pro-cyclical. So if there's a sudden rise in total factor productivity that would drive inflation expectations lower, or even potentially inflation expectations negative, if you have deflation, you have a corresponding rise in the real rate. So the actual effect on the neutral rate is somewhat ambiguous here. Or excuse me, on the nominal rate is ambiguous because yes, inflation expectations could be falling, but the real rate could be rising. If those things offset one to one, then actually there really should not be much of an effect on nominal interest rates from supply driven deflation at all. And in terms of financial intermediation, now I should say in our paper, the way that we measure financial intermediation is by looking at the money multiplier. And we do this primarily because we have consistent data across all countries from this period of broad money to outside money. The insight, actually, if I can give you and your co-author Josh Hendrickson a compliment, came from a paper from you guys called Great Spending Crashes. And the idea in your paper is that the money multiplier is more than just sort of maybe an accounting relationship, but instead reflects the relative strength of demand for inside money, bank issued money, and outside money, which under a gold standard would have been gold. So it very well could be the case that in when there's a positive productivity shock, that the demand for inside and outside money increase by roughly the same amount, in which case we wouldn't really expect to see much of an effect on financial intermediation either in the case of a positive productivity shock. And so later on in the paper, that's the other ththing we do is we want to say, look, Bernanke makes this claim in the 2002 speech where he's basically saying, look, this is a theoretical possibility, but it's not obvious that there's any, how empirically meaningful is this sort of theoretical curiosity? And one of the things that we find is that actually positive supply shocks account for a non-trivial amount of the variation in both real output and the price level under the classical gold standard period, which is the sample time that we're looking at.
Yeah, so we need to be careful when thinking through periods of rapid productivity growth driven and maybe by AI in the future, but in this period is industrialization. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at a period, and you'll get to this, but we're looking at late 1800s when there was rapid economic growth. So we want to transition into this. I'll just mention now before we get to it that we will come back and maybe look a little closer at the postbellum period of the U.S. as a specific case of this, but you've got kind of a cross-sample one. So maybe walk us through, what is your data? What did you measure? How did you go about estimating these relationships?
Sure. So what we did here is we are looking at 12 countries on the gold standard. These would have been all core countries, not necessarily periphery countries. So this is going to include Canada, the United States, England, Germany, and several other European countries. And so the data is actually pretty straightforward. What we have is essentially real GDP for these countries, some measure of the price level, short-term interest rate data, and then a measure of financial intermediation, which, as I said, is not necessarily the standard measure of financial intermediation for people who are doing work on, let's say, contemporary finance, but does work for us historically, or at least we try to make the case that it should work. And so what we're going to do is something very simple. We're going to take the textbook undergraduate aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and say, look, this model has very clear predictions about what effect a demand shock or a supply shock should have on real output and the price level. Now, we're going to use a sign restricted VAR, but we're not going to use long run restrictions, which with historical data can sometimes get you some bizarre results. So instead, what we do is we're using a more recent approach that's been applied to, actually, since you mentioned England earlier, was applied to England in a recent paper in Explorations in Economic History, and has also been applied to the modern US time period. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to impose impact restrictions. And all we're going to say here is that on impact, a positive supply shock cannot cause output to fall. That seems a pretty reasonable assumption. That's the definition of a positive supply shock. And it cannot cause the price level to rise on impact. We don't impose any long run restrictions after that. So whatever happens in the long run, we are not restricting. It's only on impact. And then in the case of a demand shock, all we're saying is that in the case of a positive demand shock, the price level cannot fall and output cannot fall on impact. But again, we don't restrict what can happen in the long run. And so the other two variables that we include in that VAR are going to be short-term nominal interest rates and financial intermediation, which again, we proxy using the money multiplier. And so we pool all these countries together. So there is a bit of an assumption here that these countries were similar enough that it's justifiable to pool them together. Although in the appendix of the paper, we do this individually and we see the same pattern. We're going to pool all these countries together and we're going to say, look, we'll leave the effect on short-term nominal interest rates and financial intermediation unrestricted. And we're just going to look at how these two variables respond to what we call positive supply and positive demand shocks.
Yeah, and before we get to your results, I just want to look at a table that you provide, kind of the summary statistics. And this just right off the bat should be very suggestive, but those just means and standard deviations, but it's very telling, I think. So again, you're looking at a period from 1880 to 1900, and I'll list the countries: Australia, Belgium, Canada, Switzerland, Germany, Denmark, UK, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, United States. And the mean growth rate over that 20-year period is 2.5%. So is rapid growth. Some of them got as high as 4%, but the mean was 2.5%. And the average growth of the price level was about a minus 0.19 or minus 0.2%. I mean, so it was a gradual, mild decline in the price level with some fairly robust growth. And the average interest rate was 3.8. On average, you had positive financial intermediation growth as well, close to 2%. So just looking at the overall picture, that the secular trends, the steady state of sorts, you see a world where there's economic growth, there's mild deflation, there's financial intermediation, there's no zero lower bound problem. So the world did not end. Now, there's wars and other things happening that do cause problems. But I think that's worth noting right out the gate that this period, now not every country had deflation at the same rate, at the same time, but this is the bigger point, I think. So I think that by itself is very telling. So, and for those who don't know, I know most of the listeners probably do know, but a VAR is a vector autoregression, and it's a way of looking at common patterns in the data, time series patterns. So what Bryan's doing is he's looking at the typical shock in the data. What is a typical outcome? You have a typical supply shock, what happens? You have typical demand shock, what happens? So maybe walk us through those results.
Yeah, so on the note of the summary statistics, you actually bring up a really good point that I would like to highlight for those of you who would like to go look at the paper. Another thing that jumps out at me right off the bat is just looking at the scatter plots of real GDP, short-term nominal interest rates, financial intermediation, and whether or not you have inflation and deflation. There's an older paper from Atchison and Kehoe in the American Economic Review in 2004 that they don't look at nominal interest rates and financial intermediation. They're just looking at output and deflation. And again, I was really struck by their paper. And then there was a few other papers more recently by Claudio Borio, where they did scatter plots like this. And right off the bat, you look at these and you're like, this is sort of weird, right? There's not an obvious connection in the data. Now, of course, that is not dispositive by any means, but you would expect to see, if this was something pretty negative, you would expect to see it in the data, and you don't immediately see it. But to get to your question about what do we see then in the vector autoregression, essentially what the vector autoregression allows us to do is to say, how did these variables evolve over a 10-year period following a positive productivity shock or a negative demand shock, because we look at both. And so what do we see? Unsurprisingly, in the case of a positive productivity shock, we see real output growth rise. Now, again, we don't impose that it has to rise in the long run. We only say that in order for it to be a supply shock, it has to rise, or actually more specifically, it cannot fall on impact. And so unsurprisingly, we see positive productivity shocks increase real GDP growth over that entire 10-year time horizon. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. Now, on impact, we see the price level initially fall, and then over time, it gradually goes back up to its long-run trend. Those of you who are familiar with how a gold standard works, this is not altogether surprising, because the price level would revert back to its average because the gold supply essentially increases when there's an increase in demand for monetary gold. So a gold standard is going to stabilize the price level, at least on a longer time horizon. So on impact, we have some deflation, and then the price level returns back up to trend. Now, critically, though, what we're curious about is interest rates, short-term interest rates, and financial intermediation. And so here, what we see is that there's some evidence of a really small, and when I say small, because you have to keep in mind we're already talking about interest rates, right? So we're talking about a 5% decrease of 5%. So very small decrease in short-term nominal interest rates, and then they immediately basically jump right back up to their long-term trend. Nothing like a liquidity trap or effective lower bound or anything like that. And then when it comes to financial intermediation, the confidence bands are pretty wide, but if you just look at the median response, at least on impact, it's basically zero. And over time, there's a slight increase in financial intermediation. Again, the way to interpret that would be that there was an increase in demand for bank issued money relative to gold, which is sort of the opposite of what you would expect if there's financial disintermediation. If people lack confidence in the banking system, they're not going to be willing to hold redeemable bank issued money. They're going to opt to try to get rid of that money and hold gold or silver instead. So that's the major headline result here, is that despite the major claims to the contrary, we don't see any obvious evidence of supply driven deflation driving nominal interest rates and financial intermediation lower. If anything, seems to basically be close to zero effect on short-term nominal interest rates and a slightly positive effect on financial intermediation.
And that's what you would expect from the interest rate response. Basically, zero response. In fact, your confidence intervals, they're both above zero, below zero. So basically, there's nothing significant in terms of the interest rate response. But as you mentioned earlier, that's what you might expect. If you might have inflation going down, which you do, your price level shock shows us. But the flip side is implicitly you have that real rate going up, so it would be a wash, and that's why there's nothing significant happening to this. So that's really amazing. Now your demand shock gives you everything you would expect, right?
That's exactly right. So the next thing we want to look at, and actually we got this idea from a paper that you wrote that your listeners should go read on the postbellum deflation in the United States, which is a critic of our view could say, well, Bryan, pretty interesting historical result you have here, but perhaps nominal rigidities were not as much of a problem at the end of the 19th century as they are today. And so it doesn't matter the source of the shock. It could have been a demand shock. It could have been a supply shock. It doesn't matter. Deflation wouldn't have been a problem if prices were flexible enough that we don't have a movement along that short run aggregate supply curve. So that's what we want to go look at next to say, all right, is there any evidence of nominal rigidities? Now, we don't impose a source of that. We're just saying, look, do demand shocks have real effects on the economy? And that's exactly what we find. So what we look at here are negative aggregate demand shocks. And we find that a negative aggregate demand shock does in fact reduce output. And the effect is pretty long lasting, which we want to reiterate in the paper. We think that demand-driven deflation is very bad, right? So it's not as if we're saying, oh, deflation all the time is great. It's like, no, demand-driven deflation is bad. Central banks should pursue policies that prevent that from happening. So we do see a decrease in output. Of course, we see a decrease in the price level. That's what we would expect. Here, the effect on short-term nominal interest rates is actually negative, more negative, I should say, than in the case of the supply shock, and it lasts much longer. In other words, you don't see that return back up to a long-run trend on short-term nominal interest rates following what we call an aggregate demand shock. Again, with financial intermediation, we don't see a gradual increase. The median response is actually negative on impact and continues to be negative throughout a 10-year time horizon after the fact. So again, we agree that demand-driven deflation has the effects that are that the conventional view of deflation associates with it. But in the case of supply-driven deflation, it's not so obvious that the problems that people point to are actually problems.
Yeah, so your demand shocks that you estimate, they show you, the data shows you exactly what the textbook, description would suggest, what most people would suggest if you went and asked, typical macroeconomists. It's just surprising for many what happens on the supply shock. And again, this is over years. This isn't just, like 1 month, 2 months. This is a significant time period. So this is useful, right? It tells us that, one, you can have supply-driven deflation. And again, it's usually mild. We look at the summary statistics. We never had the type of deflation you had during the Great Depression, where the price level fell 30%. We're talking, maybe 1% at most, or less than that.
Mm-hmm.
But you can have this benign scenario. Deflation it's accommodated by all these rapid gains. People are better off overall. It's just so foreign to us, Bryan. That's the problem. It's so foreign to us. But we may need to come to terms with it, and we'll come back to this point later as we talk about AI. Now, you did one more thing in the paper before we leave your paper. So you showed supply-driven deflation is possible, and it occurred. You showed that demand-driven deflation also occurs, and it was meaningful in the late 1800s. There were nominal rigidities that caused real losses. But the question could be, well, how important? I mean, we can all do regressions with a low R squared, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look, statistically significant. Is it economically significant? Was there meaningful amount of supply-driven deflation during this period?
So that's a great question. So again, what we do here is we say, how much of supply shocks can account for variation, the observed variation in output and observed variation in the price level, observed variation in interest rates, and observed variation in financial intermediation. And here what we find is that the supply shocks account for 20% of the observed fluctuation in output over 10-year horizons. Demand shocks account for 17, or basically almost 18%. So both of these are, of course, meaningful, which is exactly what you would expect, that an economies are buffeted by both supply and demand shocks, and they can have real effects. Same thing on prices, that 15% of the variation in prices can be explained by positive supply shocks. About 16% of the fluctuations in short-term nominal interest rates can be accounted for by positive supply shocks, and about 14% of fluctuations in financial intermediation can be accounted for by positive supply shocks. So again, if in that particular part of the paper, we'd go back to that 2002 speech by Ben Bernanke, where he makes this point about how, look, this is a theoretical curiosity, not obvious that there's any empirical counterpart to this. But if we look at these countries under the gold standard, I would say that 20% of the output variation and 15% of the price level variation being explained by positive productivity shocks is far from trivial.
Yeah, and I'm glad you went back to Ben Bernanke. I was at the U.S. Department of Treasury when he made that speech, and I actually emailed him. He was just a governor back then before he became chair. He actually responded to my email. I was shocked. I mean, he was a rock star to us back then, and he was a governor. And in fact, I recall one story where he came to Treasury for a meeting. I made a point to be the guy to meet him at the front door, walk him to his meeting. But I emailed him. I said, look, couldn't we be in the midst of supply-driven deflation? Again, during this period, let me just to recap, 2002, 2004, go look at productivity growth. It was rapid. It didn't last long, only 2 years. Many attribute it to kind of like the delayed effect of all the fiber optic cables that were laid across during the stock market boom, the asset boom of the late 90s. Kind of, it was a bubble, but kind of the fruition of it finally coming to bear in the data. And he conceded to me in the email. In fact, I've saved this email. He conceded, yeah, it could be, but I just don't know. We don't know. So it would be interesting at some point, Bryan, you and your co-author go back and maybe look at some more recent data and see how much of say that period was due to, the good type of deflationary pressures versus weakening demand. And again, I see it the way I read it, I see it as the more benign. But I want to just flesh this out, because there's still maybe people out there saying, oh, Bryan, you're looking at averages across countries and stuff. And I would say, no, these are good results. But just to make this concrete, you mentioned a paper that I did. Now I'm going to bring this up just to make this as concrete as possible before we go to policy implications. But the paper I wrote is a 2007 paper titled Postbellum Deflation and Its Lessons for Today. And I was motivated in part because of this very quote where Bernanke says, I don't know of any real world, example. And someone actually had asked him at a different time, well, what about the late 1800s? He goes, that's a mixed bag. So my purpose in this paper was twofold. One, I went out and I collected as much data as I could about this period. And I go from 1866, really the end of the Civil War, all the way up to 1897. This was a 30-year period, secular deflation. And I collected as much data. I went and looked at all the different measures of output. I got several financial intermediation measures and inflation measures. And I collected the data, one, because Bernanke says it wasn't clear. So I wanted to say let's make this as clear as possible. And the secondly, as you mentioned and alluded to, I did a vector autoregression testing whether the demand shocks during this period were trivial. Do they actually matter? But just a quick summary here for those of you who are listening. Between 1866 and 1897, so this 30-year period, we had deflation that averaged just a little over 2% a year. So just imagine it. Every year we get deflation. It becomes normal. 30-year period of deflation. And over that same period, we had almost 4% growth, 3.7 to be precise, but almost 4% growth, about 2% deflation. Now, there was some variation early on, right after the Civil War. The government was trying to get out of debt, all the debt it issued, so it ran deflation a little more rapidly. So from 1866 to 1879, there was 4% deflation, but there was still 4% growth. And then from 1880 to 1897, it's closer to the numbers that Bryan has, 0.8% deflation and 3.4% growth. Bottom line is this: there was rapid growth and there was persistent deflation, and the world did not end. I look at things in terms of financial intermediation, loan to GDP, and other measures like that, deposits to currency ratios. And the overall trend is upward. Yes, there were some disruptions. The 1870s, there's a crisis, early 1890s. So there's all this evidence that this was actually a robust period. Productivity growth was robust. You never had zero lower bound problems. Interest rates were 4 to 5% over this period. Now, just a few comments. I know the skeptics out there. What about the agrarian unrest, Bryan? You know they're going to say this. What about, the famous Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan? And that's a fair comment. And I'd like to hear maybe what your take. My take would be, we were in the midst of a structural change, and some of this protest was resulting from that fact that farmers were no longer the dominant economic sector, and higher inflation would not have changed their outcome. What are your thoughts about the agrarian protests in relation to monetary outcomes?
We've gotten this comment before about this, and I think it's definitely point taken. But again, I think it's very difficult sometimes when it's difficult to look at what people say they're angry about and sort of like try to tightly map that onto what's going on with policy. It's not obvious to me anyway that often what voters are often angry about reflects sort of a sophisticated understanding of what's going on economically. It could just be that, William Jennings Bryan was able to identify a particular hobby horse that resonated with a group that was on the losing side of a structural change, as you mentioned, and that was the rallying cry. Again, not obvious to me that having positive inflation during that time period would have brought about better outcomes for anybody, farmers included. So that's my general take, is that people, voters, whatever, they get angry about various things. It's not at all obvious to me that tells us that period was in fact overall very bad. And again, even if the deflation was bad for the farmers, it's again not obvious that trying to offset that through whatever. I mean, you didn't really have an central bank. The Treasury, of course, could have engaged in some sort of like quasi open market operations, but you didn't have a central bank in the U.S. anyway that could have offset something like that. It's not at all obvious that trying to offset supply-driven deflation is a free lunch. So that's the other criticism that we'll sometimes hear is saying, okay, fine, interesting, but like, why not just price level target? And so whenever there's a positive supply shock, you'd want to have the central bank should lower its policy rate, boost aggregate demand to keep the price level if you wanted to do like a price level target as opposed to an inflation target. But here again, there's research showing, you've published research on this too, showing that actually can create an unsustainable credit boom that then subsequently leads to financial distress later on. And we cite some other papers in our paper here too, which is that it's price level stabilization is not a free lunch. So even if there were some groups like farmers during the postbellum period that were worse off because of sustained productivity driven deflation, it's not clear that even if you had a central bank that could have offset that you would want to from a welfare standpoint.
Yeah. If from maybe a technical perspective, we can say the terms of trade for farmers were getting worse. And so maybe it looked like higher prices would have helped them, but there's a lot of other things that they consume that would also probably have been more expensive as well. So overall, I mean, I think the evidence is pretty clear from that period. Overall, Americans were better off because of the industrialization, and the deflation at the time was a byproduct of that. One other comment on this period, and I've had this said many times to me, folks will say, oh, but if you go look at the NBER business cycles, you'll see the longest recession on record is from 1873 to 1879. And what's interesting is there's been a lot of research that says that is bunk. That is largely a relic of how the NBER originally dated that. There's been more recent research, and Christina Romer's had a better measures of GDP. But even since her, a guy named, I think it was Joseph Davis, he had several NBER papers where he went back. And what they all show is that this recession from 1873 to 1875 was 1 to 2 years at most, so much smaller. Now, there was something there, and they all say something in the early 1890s was pretty serious. There was a depression. But again, the overall period was one of rapid growth, mild deflation, real wages going up, no zero lower bound problem. And it just shows this is a concrete case of where it did happen and how we could look to it for some insights should we enter into a world like that again. Now, I think we've made the case, Bryan. I think, we will leave it there and let listeners go check out the papers and stuff. We'll provide links to your paper as well as my postbellum paper. But here's where I want to take this. So we are possibly on the cusp of something similar. I mean, I hope we are. I hope we have rapid productivity growth. AI does, it's truly transformative, but there's some issues that come with that. And there's been a lot of press on this. So there's been concerns about structural change. We just talked about farmers. There could be, white collar folks who are losing out. A number of pieces. In fact, let me just go pull a few up here. There was a New York Times piece that was titled, "A white-collar bloodbath doesn't have to be our fate." And it goes in, hey, we can make a choice, how we handle this, how it comes. Here's an article from CBS titled, "As AI threatens white-collar work, more young Americans choose blue-collar careers." And then I was at work, someone shared this with me. There's an organization that's talking about international AI benefit sharing. How do we make the gains from AI accessible to all people, not just those who are fortunate to be a part of the initial access and gains from it? And so there are these real problems, and there's been solutions thrown out. Bryan, you know this as well as I, but universal basic income. Okay, rapid productivity growth. Let's take some of those gains, tax them. Maybe we set up a sovereign wealth fund for the U.S. and I don't mean the Bitcoin version, but we set up something and we just take those and we transfer it back to Americans. There's been talk of baby bonds or baby equity packages. Everyone can participate in it, or maybe privatizing Social Security and people could participate in America Inc. But what would be an implication of your work here? What would be another solution for people to participate widely in these economic gains?
I mean, my own view tends to be somewhat skeptical of a lot of these solutions to the problem. And it's not because I'm heartless. It's because oftentimes I think once you start addressing some of the public choice issues that come into play when it comes to crafting policy, that a lot of things that sound like a good idea on the blackboard or the whiteboard, as the case might be, once they hit the real world of politics, they end up not working so great. My general view is that I think we should make it as easy as possible for people to reallocate themselves to various tasks. So anything that prevents people from easily changing careers, particularly anything that surrounding like occupational licensing or other types of labor market frictions that are driven primarily by government. I'm not saying all labor market frictions are driven by government policy, but those that are driven by government policy, I think policymakers should be thinking about ways to get those burdens out of the way so that people can go to where the jobs are very easily. And if we want to make that a little bit easier by offering perhaps more generous unemployment benefits or a UBI, we can kick those ideas around. But again, I'm always sort of skeptical with some of these because it's one thing to talk about, oh, this is how an ideal government response to problem X would be, but we don't live in an ideal world and we don't have an ideal government and we never will. And so then the question is what sort of solution are we likely to get with the actual policymakers that we have or that we think we will have in the immediate future? And there it becomes the case for a lot of these things becomes a little less clear. So my general view is let's make it as easy as possible for people to change careers, to go to where those jobs are. And to the extent that we have policies in place that prevent that, and those policies don't really pass a cost benefit analysis, let's scrap those. Now, I recognize that My own suggestion here is also subject to the same public choice critiques that I would have of these other
Sure.
solutions. But my own sort of just ideological disposition is typically, hey, let's get these what are often, in my view, arbitrary barriers that prevent people from switching careers. Let's get those out of the way so that folks can go to where the jobs are.
Yeah. So two comments on that. I like what you're saying there. So one of the biggest barriers today, let alone in the future of AI, is housing, right? It's hard to afford housing where the jobs are. So someone loses their job in Michigan, they can move down to Texas. But maybe Texas isn't the best example now because they do build a lot of housing down there. But they want to move, say, to San Francisco. Okay, that's a nice city to pick on. And the housing supply is very inelastic. They can't build. There's regulations. And one of the fundamental reasons, I know you know this, our listeners know this, that we have a housing shortage is because in America, housing is one of the primary assets people hold on to. It's the way they save for retirement. It's their investment. So it's an investment vehicle. It's also a consumption good. It's both. And there's a tension there. You want your asset price to go up in value, but you want consumption to be affordable. And which of those tensions will win? And the past few decades, it seems like the asset side view of housing has dominated. NIMBYs not in my backyard because I want my home prices to go up in value and all those other good things. If we had a world of rapid economic growth, again, I'm not suggesting this, but like baby bonds, or somehow we have Americans more vested in America Inc., that might take some of this tension off houses as an asset that we have to preserve at all costs. But my second comment would be this. I think, more fundamentally, all of these suggestions are about how to distribute the real gains broadly. Checks to people, equity in America Inc. I think just let Americans participate through a lower price level. Let the real gains be translated broadly through things getting cheaper and cheaper over time. And, and to be clear, I think both of us champion something like a nominal income target. You can preserve and keep stable nominal wages, but those nominal wages could go farther and farther if the price level is gently falling. People would feel better off. How everyone's kind of upset now because everything's more expensive. Imagine a 30-year run like the postbellum period where everything got cheaper over time. I think that's, to me, a way to distribute the real gains that doesn't require a whole nother level of bureaucracy or public choice issues. Let the market do its magic.
So I agree 100%. And I think that it also just makes things a little bit more intuitive to most people that when the economy is doing better, prices for things should be falling. And in fact, I believe you've had Carola Binder on the program before. She's done work on like consumer survey data. And the interesting thing there is that it seems that despite all of the comments that you often hear that the public don't understand nominal income targeting, but they understand inflation targeting, that's not at all obvious from how, like, let's say households think about inflation and poor economic performance. In other words, the households associate high inflation with slow economic growth, right? That's a negative productivity shock, right? That's as opposed to, let's say, high inflation and positive growth, which would be a positive demand shock. So I think it makes sense, obviously, let these things pass through to the price level. I think another reason, and this is more in the case of a negative supply shock than a positive, but I guess it would go both ways. I have a short article at AIER that I wrote last year, and it's basically a political economy case for nominal income targeting. And the argument that I made goes something like this. The public often don't understand, or it's very difficult for non-economists to look at the growth effects of various policies, whether that be tariffs or tax policy, regulatory policy, et cetera, right? Instead, the inflation can be something that can be very salient for voters. And so when you have a central bank that's inflation targeting, and you have, let's say, policymakers pursue either good, let's say, like pro-growth policy, or perhaps they pursue bad growth policy. If the central bank offsets those by targeting the inflation rate, they in some sense are short-circuiting this mechanism that would otherwise get the voters happy about pro-growth policies or angry about bad growth policies.
That's a great point.
So in other words, now it seems like right now the Fed has, the Fed has been saying they want to look through the effect of tariffs. I'll have more to say on that in just a second, but they've said they want to look through the effect of tariffs. So they're going to let those pass through to the price level, which of course, in my view, is what they should do. But my point is that if you think the tariffs are a bad idea and you want the voters to get frustrated about them and vote in a way that leads to policy changes, then targeting inflation to prevent that from passing through to the price level, in some sense, short circuits this process whereby a democracy can work where the voters say, hey, I'm not happy about this. I'm not quite sure why I'm not happy about it, but prices are higher. I'm going to vote for the people that I think are responsible for that, or against the people that are responsible for that. And the same thing would go for positive supply shock. So if AI, like if our policymakers, which I hope they do, adopt a good framework that allows a lot of innovation in AI, by allowing the price level to fall, the voters, again, they're going to say, this is great, right? I want to reward the people that I deem responsible for this. So I think a downside, actually, a political economy downside to inflation targeting is that you short circuit that process whereby the voters can register their approval or disapproval with policies by looking at what's going on with inflation.
That is a great point. We'll provide a link to your piece where you make that case. Let's go back briefly to the point you made earlier about this. If, in fact, the Fed did try to offset rapid productivity gains, again, assuming a wonderful world of AI-driven growth, it actually could create some credit misallocation, some asset bubbles, for lack of a better word. And this is not just something you and I are talking about, or Austrian. I know Austrians are well known for Austrian economists, but Larry Cristiano and some co-authors had a paper on this at Jackson Hole, I believe 2010, or it was sometimes early 2010s. But his point is, if you have like a Taylor rule and you have rapid, and you expect rapid productivity growth, you're going to have a pretty wide divergence between the actual overnight rate and the neutral rate. And that's going to create this misallocation in terms of credit. So you can create, asset booms and bust cycles if you do try to offset these things. So it's more than just like equity and getting the real gains out. It's also about stabilizing the business cycle. Now, let me ask this question, Bryan. So I think we all agree, you and I agree at least, maybe some of our listeners do as well, on how to approach such a world, which we all hope we get, of rapid productivity growth, rapid real gains from AI. How could we transition to a framework that allows the Fed to comfortably, kind of land and come into a place where it tolerates a little disinflation, maybe even deflation? Right now, I think they would have an allergic reaction to that. What would be a first step, do you think, to getting us to a place where central bankers would be okay with what we've been talking about?
So I think I have two answers here. So one, of course, is very self-serving, which is that this is partly why we wrote the paper, is to try to change people's. Yes, right. Is to try to change people's perspectives. Now, again, criticism could be that, interesting, Bryan, but that's the gold standard. It doesn't apply today. And my response to that would be like, I agree. That is totally true. But the problem is that in order for us to tease this out, we have to go to a period where you didn't have central banks that are actively trying to offset supply-driven inflation or supply-driven deflation. And that's just not the world that we've lived in, basically, sort of post-World War II-ish, right? So that's the first thing, is let's just go look at the research here. And of course, our paper is one among many in this space that makes this point from a slightly different angle. But if they don't want to buy the paper, that's fine, right? So then my second view would be, say, okay, most policymakers think in terms of R star. And one of the things that I really learned from you, and I learned from George Selgin, and I learned from Scott Sumner when I was first getting into this, is that despite my sort of small government and pro-market proclivities, I often think that the best response is for the government to just get out of the way. It's not possible for central banks to do nothing. They can't. They literally cannot do nothing. And so if you start thinking in terms of like an R star framework, then the question is, okay, an AI boom presumably drives R star higher. And so how should the Fed respond to that? I think when we use these terms like, the Fed should look through a supply shock, that means the Fed is doing nothing. The Fed is not doing nothing. From a policy standpoint, the Fed is not doing nothing if it's looking through a supply shock. In the case of a negative supply shock, it should be cutting rates. In the case of a positive supply shock, it should be raising them. And so that's the first thing, is if you don't buy the paper, is just say, okay, if you buy the R star framework, then the Fed's job is essentially to adjust its policy rate in response to movements in R star, which, all the caveats there of it's difficult to observe and whatever. But we at least, I think, hopefully agree in principle that a positive total factor productivity shock should drive R star higher, and thus the appropriate response from the central bank should be to follow the neutral rate up. And in fact, we know, if the central bank does not follow the neutral rate up, then monetary policy is in essence too loose. Now we can argue about, okay, well, how do we actually identify this? And you've written about this, Scott has written about this, of how you would go about implementing a nominal income target. But I think, if you're a policymaker and you don't buy my argument, that's fine. Or don't buy the paper, that's fine. But just again, think in terms of this sort of neutral rate versus policy rate framework. If the neutral rate's going up, the Fed should be following it up. I mean, I think that's sort of what's consistent with its mandate. But, I'm sure people disagree with me about that.
No, that's a great point that you bring up. What would happen to interest rates in this world? So I've had on the show an individual named Zachary Majalis, and he's written a paper with Basil Halperin, and they kind of do some scenario playing out. What if you have rapid growth? And I've asked previous guests this. So just imagine we go to, say, 5% real GDP trend growth, and maybe even higher than, but let's just say 5%. That would imply quite significantly higher real rates is what you're getting to. And of course, the point they bring up is a different point. What should the U.S. Treasury be doing? If you're AI bullish, you should probably lock in the rates we have today long-term, because in the future, they're going to be higher. But of course, in the future, we'll also have more income base to tax from. But your point's well taken. Our star should be significantly higher in that world. So here's what I might do, as I would adopt what you said there, but I also think it's why a nominal income framework would be useful, and that if we adopted one today, right, under normal circumstances, so let's say 4% nominal income growth, it builds in roughly 2% real growth, and that's kind of where we think potential real GDP is, 2% inflation target, and we get used to that. And if we start putting our minds around a 4% nominal income, nominal GDP target, and then let's say we get these structural shifts, or now let's say real GDP is growing permanently at 4%. So now if we're going to stick with that 4% nominal GDP target, we're going to have 0% inflation. And if it goes even faster, we get our mild deflation. But I think one thing we could do is to change the thinking from focusing on inflation to focusing on total spending or total incomes, and complement that with focusing on R star.
I completely agree. And I think the Fed actually missed a good opportunity here with its recent framework review to do something a little bit more drastic. They basically went back to the 2016 framework, and which I think is probably an improvement over the version of flexible average inflation targeting that we had. But the point here being is that we just got done living through 40-year high inflation. We can quibble about what the source of that was, but the point here being is that doing something that was a little bit different than what's been done before, this was probably our best chance to have done it. And instead, we just went back to the pre-COVID status quo. I think that was a real missed opportunity, unfortunately, by the Fed to do something like a nominal income target, which would address many issues like how should the Fed respond to AI? How should the Fed respond to tariffs? I think that kind of the point that Casey and I make in the paper is that we think that the Fed, or an implication of the point we make in the paper, is that the Fed should look through something like tariffs, but it should also look through something like AI. It should take a symmetric approach to both of these things that would be consistent with promoting long-run macroeconomic stability, in our view.
Well, Bryan, we are running near the end here, and I want to leave it with you, give you the final word. What are the big takeaways that listeners should take with them, and what should policymakers take with them?
So I want to go back to this U.S. case that you brought up. And so when you look at the U.S. and you see that we've got, during the postbellum period after the Civil War, we've got robust growth and sustained deflation throughout the period. An important point to keep in mind here is that the U.S. banking system was particularly crisis prone, which is partially why those events that you mentioned occurred. And nonetheless, the supply-driven deflation really did not seem to be that much of a problem. And so the point here being is that other countries like Canada, they had much better banking regulation and banking systems than the U.S. And so a lot of the issues that the U.S. dealt with during this period really had very little to do with, let's say, deflation, and more to do with the peculiarities of U.S. banking regulation. In fact, my co-author, Casey Pender, he recently published a paper on this in the Journal of Macro, where he looked at the bank failures and deflation, and what he found was that the bank failures occurred with aggregate demand driven deflation, but not supply driven deflation in the case of the postbellum United States. So I think that's a really important point here, is that even despite the issues with the U.S. banking system during the postbellum period, we still have robust economic growth and supply driven deflation. As far as policy goes going forward, again, I hope that folks at the Fed and other people that are in a position to influence monetary policy, certainly more than the humble Florida Atlantic University professor is, will recognize that there are cases where a falling price level is not to be feared, and that we can get a better monetary policy framework by thinking in terms of either nominal income targeting, if that's how you prefer to think about the world, or thinking about how productivity, whether it's positive or negative, how that affects our star, and thus how should the central bank respond to fluctuations in our star. So that would be my advice going forward.
Okay. Our guest today has been Bryan Cutsinger. His paper, co-authored along with Casey Pender, is titled Rethinking Deflation and Its Effects, a Cross-Country Analysis of Supply-Driven Deflation. Be sure to check it out. Bryan, thank you once again for coming back on the podcast.
Great to be with you, David. Thanks for having me back.
Macro Musings is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dive deeper into our research at mercatus.org/monetary policy. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you like this podcast, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review. This helps other thoughtful people like you find the show. Find me on Twitter at David Beckworth and follow the show at macro_musings.